January 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final and most brutal phase. The Allied armies were pushing deeper into territory once controlled by Nazi Germany. Every mile gained came at a terrible cost. Thousands of soldiers had already died. Thousands more would die before the war was over. Across frozen forests, ruined villages, and shattered battlefields, men fought not only against an enemy, but against exhaustion, fear, and the constant death. Among those men was a young American soldier who looked nothing like a war. He wasn't tall. He wasn't physically intimidating. He didn't possess the commanding presence people often associate with legendary warriors. In fact, many people who met him before the war doubted he even belonged in the military. He weighed barely over 100 pounds. His frame was thin, his appearance unremarkable. Yet before the war ended, this young soldier would become one of the most fighting men on the battlefield. His name was Audie Murphy, and according to numerous accounts from fellow soldiers, German forces quickly learned that wherever Murphy appeared, trouble followed. Years later, military historians would describe him as one of the most effective combat soldiers of the entire war. But in January 1945, none of that was guaranteed. At that moment, Murphy was simply another infantryman trying to survive. What made him different was his refusal to quit. Again and again, he placed himself in situations that most soldiers would avoid. Again and again, he volunteered for dangerous missions. Again and again, he found himself facing impossible odds. And somehow, he kept surviving. The strange thing is that Murphy never set out to become famous. Like millions of Americans during World War II, he simply wanted to serve his country. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he attempted to enlist. At first, he was rejected. Some recruiters believed he was too small, too young-looking, too weak. But Murphy refused to give up. Eventually, he found a way into the Army. That decision would change his life forever. Within a few short years, the skinny teenager from Texas would become one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history. But fame came later. First came the battlefield. And on those battlefields, Murphy developed a reputation that spread far. Own unit. His fellow soldiers admired him. His commanders trusted him. And somewhere across the front lines, German troops began hearing his name. Because there was something unusual about Audie Murphy. He seemed to appear wherever the fighting was worst. And when the situation became desperate, he often became even more dangerous. Before long, stories about the young American started circulating among both and foe. Stories of impossible attacks. Stories of incredible bravery. Stories that sounded more like Hollywood than reality. Yet many of them were true. And as the war continued, the legend of Audie Murphy grew larger with every year. A legend that would eventually make him one of the most valuable targets on the battlefield. A man the Nazis desperately wanted to stop, no matter the cost. When Audie Murphy arrived in combat, he wasn't a famous soldier. He wasn't a decorated hero. He wasn't even particularly well known within his own unit. He was simply another young American infantryman entering one of the most environments on Earth. And like every new soldier, he quickly discovered that war was very different from what he had imagined. The battlefield didn't care about courage. It didn't care about dreams. It didn't care about medals. War was chaos. Noise, fear, confusion, and survival often came down to seconds. Murphy experienced that reality firsthand during the Allied campaigns in Sicily and Italy. For many American soldiers, those campaigns were their first taste of combat against experienced German forces. The Germans were skilled, disciplined, and determined. They knew how to use terrain. They knew how to organize defenses. And they knew how to make every advance costly. Again and again, American troops found themselves fighting uphill against positions. Machine guns, mortars, snipers, artillery. Every step forward came with risk. For a young soldier like Murphy, the learning curve was brutal, but something quickly became apparent. He possessed an unusual ability to remain calm under pressure. While others froze, Murphy reacted. While others hesitated, Murphy moved. And while many soldiers focused only on survival, Murphy constantly searched for ways to gain an advantage. His officers noticed. His fellow soldiers noticed. And before long, Murphy began receiving responsibilities that normally went to experienced men. The reason was simple. He could be trusted, not because he never felt fear. Years later, Murphy openly admitted that he was often afraid. Every soldier was. The difference was that fear didn't stop him from acting. Again and again, he volunteered for dangerous assignments, scouting enemy positions, crossing exposed ground, gathering intelligence, tasks that carried a high probability of death. Yet Murphy kept accepting them. And somehow, he kept coming back. One of the most remarkable things about Murphy was his ability to spot opportunities during combat. Many soldiers focused only on the enemy directly in front of them. Murphy constantly observed the larger picture. He looked for weaknesses, openings, mistakes, moments where bold action could change the outcome of a fight. This mindset made him incredibly effective. It also made him increasingly valuable. As the war continued, Murphy's reputation spread throughout his unit. Stories began circulating. Stories about impossible situations. Stories about attacks that should have failed. Stories about one young soldier repeatedly finding ways to survive. At first, many of those stories sounded exaggerated. War has a way of creating legends. But in Murphy's case, the truth was often just as impressive as the rumors. Each battle added another chapter. Each mission added another story. Each success made his reputation grow. And as his reputation grew, something else happened. German forces started encountering him more frequently. They didn't know his name yet. Most had never seen his face. But they were beginning to notice a pattern. Whenever certain American units launched aggressive attacks, whenever unexpected resistance appeared, whenever positions that should have held suddenly collapsed, the same young American soldier often seemed to be nearby. At first, this meant nothing. After all, thousands of soldiers were fighting across Europe. One infantryman couldn't possibly make that much difference. Or could he? The answer would become clearer as the war moved north into France. Because there, Audie Murphy would begin performing actions so extraordinary that even experienced combat veterans struggled to believe them. And it was in France that the legend truly began. A legend that would eventually attract the attention of the enemy itself. Because before long, Murphy wasn't just surviving battles. He was changing them. By the summer of 1944, the war had entered a new phase. The Allies had landed in Normandy. German forces were retreating, but they remained incredibly dangerous. Every village, every forest, every hill could become a battlefield. And for American infantrymen like Audie Murphy, France would become the place legends were made, or where they died. The fighting was relentless. German soldiers were experienced veterans. Many had been fighting since the beginning of the war. They knew how to build defensive positions. They knew how to use machine guns effectively. And they knew how to make every Allied advance costly. Murphy and his fellow soldiers often found themselves moving through terrain that seemed peaceful from a distance. Green fields, quiet roads, small villages. But hidden behind those landscapes were German soldiers waiting to open fire. The danger was constant. A single machine gun could stop an entire advance. A sniper could pin down dozens of men. An artillery strike could wipe out a platoon in seconds. And yet Murphy seemed to thrive in this environment. Again and again, he demonstrated something the commanders value more than almost any other trait: initiative. When others waited for orders, Murphy acted. When opportunities appeared, he took them. And when situations became desperate, he often became the first man, moving toward the danger rather than away from it. One battle in particular began spreading his reputation throughout the division. During an engagement against German positions, Murphy found his unit pinned. Enemy fire. The machine guns were preventing movement. Every attempt to advance was met with bullets. The situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. Most soldiers would have stayed behind cover. Murphy did the opposite. Using terrain and vegetation for concealment, he began moving toward the position. Every step exposed him to danger. Every second increased the chances that he would be spotted. But he kept moving, closer and closer, until he was within striking distance. Then he attacked. The German position was eliminated. The advance resumed, and lives were saved. For the soldiers who witnessed it, the moment was unforgettable, not because Murphy was fearless, but because he was willing to act when action seemed impossible. Stories like this became increasingly common. Every few weeks, another account appeared, another battle, another impossible situation. Another example of Murphy doing something most people considered suicidal and surviving. Word spread quickly among American units. Officers began taking notice. Commanders began recommending him for decorations. His list of awards grew. But something else was happening. The Germans were noticing too, not necessarily because they knew his name, at least not yet, but because certain American units seemed unusually aggressive. Certain attacks succeeded when they should have failed. Certain defensive positions collapsed unexpectedly. Again and again, reports emerged describing a small American soldier attacks, directing fire, and appearing in places where the fighting was most intense. The more Murphy distinguished himself, the harder he became to ignore. By late 1944, he had already received numerous decorations for bravery. His reputation among Allied troops was growing rapidly. Many soldiers viewed him as almost indestructible. A man who somehow survived situations that killed everyone around him. But Murphy himself never saw it that way. Years later, he would speak openly about the fear, the exhaustion, the loss, the friends who never came home. Behind every medal was a battle. Behind every battle were casualties. And behind every heroic story was a young man carrying memories that would stay with him forever. Still, the war continued. And the most famous moment of Murphy's entire military career was still ahead. A moment so extraordinary that it would eventually earn him the Medal of Honor. A moment that would transform him from a respected soldier into one of the greatest combat legends of World War II. And it was during that battle that German forces would finally discover exactly how dangerous Audie Murphy really was. January 26, 1945. Near the village of Holtzwihr, France. The weather was cold, the ground was frozen, and German forces were preparing a powerful counterattack. Audie Murphy and the men of Company B found themselves facing one of the most dangerous situations of the war. The Germans were not retreating. They were coming forward, and they were bringing armor, tanks, infantry, heavy weapons, everything necessary to crush the American position. Murphy's company had already suffered significant casualties. Many men were exhausted. Some had barely slept. Others had been fighting for days. Yet despite their condition, they were expected to hold the line. As the German attack began, the situation quickly deteriorated. Enemy infantry advanced through the trees. German machine guns opened fire. Tanks rolled forward, supporting the assault. The Americans fought back fiercely, but they were badly outnumbered. One by one, defensive positions began falling. The pressure increased. Every minute became harder to survive. Murphy watched as the enemy continued advancing. He understood something many soldiers in his position would have refused to admit. If the attack continued, his company could be wiped out. The Germans had momentum. The Americans were running out of options. Then things became even worse. Several American tank destroyers were hit. Vehicles burned. Smoke filled the battlefield. Explosions echoed across the frozen ground. The line was collapsing. At that moment, most commanders would have focused entirely on retreating, preserving what remained of their force. Murphy chose a different path. He ordered his men to fall back into nearby woods. It was the correct decision. Staying in place meant destruction, but while the others withdrew, Murphy did something almost unbelievable. He stayed behind, alone. Think about that for a moment. German infantry were advancing. Enemy armor was moving forward. Machine guns were firing. And Audie Murphy remained on the battlefield by himself. What happened next would become one of the most famous actions of World War II. Near Murphy stood a burning American tank destroyer. The vehicle had already been knocked out. Flames poured from its engine compartment. At any moment, ammunition inside could explode. Most soldiers would have moved away from it immediately. Murphy climbed onto it, alone, standing on top of a burning vehicle while enemy forces advanced. Then he found the machine gun, and he opened fire. The battlefield erupted. For nearly an hour, Murphy fought from that position. One man against an entire German assault. Wave after wave of enemy soldiers attempted to advance. Again and again, Murphy stopped them. His machine gun tore through attacking formations. Whenever the Germans moved forward, they encountered devastating fire. The burning vehicle became a fortress defended by a single American soldier. German troops had no idea how many defenders remained. From their perspective, the resistance appeared far stronger than it actually. Murphy also used a field telephone to direct American artillery onto advancing enemy positions, even while under fire, even while standing on a vehicle that could explode, even while facing overwhelming odds. He continued coordinating the defense. Shells crashed into German formations. Machine gun fire pinned down attackers. The advance slowed, then stalled, then began to break apart. The impossible was happening. One man was stopping an entire attack. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Murphy was wounded during the fighting, but he refused to leave. He refused to stop. He continued firing until ammunition ran low, and the German assault finally lost momentum. Only then did he withdraw, and even then, he immediately organized a counterattack. Despite being injured, despite everything that had happened, he led American troops back into action. The Germans retreated. The position held. The battle was won. When reports of what happened reached higher command, many officers struggled to believe them. The story sounded impossible. A single soldier holding off a major attack while standing on a burning tank destroyer. It sounded like something from a movie, yet eyewitnesses confirmed it again and again. The evidence was undeniable. Audie Murphy had accomplished something extraordinary, something so extraordinary that he would later receive the Medal of Honor, America's highest military award. But there was another consequence. After Holtzwihr, Murphy was no longer simply a respected soldier. He became a legend, and legends have a way of attracting attention, especially from the enemy. Because after that battle, German forces knew they were dealing with someone very different from the average infantryman. Someone capable of changing the outcome of battles. Someone who had become far more valuable alive than dead. And that realization would make Audie Murphy one of the most dangerous men on the battlefield. By early 1945, Audie Murphy had become far more than just another American infantryman. His name was spreading throughout the Allied forces. Officers talked about him. Soldiers told stories about him. New recruits heard rumors about him. And every new battle seemed to add another chapter to the growing legend. The remarkable thing was that many of the stories were true. In war, rumors often become exaggerated. A successful attack becomes an impossible victory. A brave action becomes a miracle. But Murphy's actual accomplishments were often impressive enough without exaggeration. Battle after battle, he placed himself in situations where survival seemed unlikely. And battle after battle, he emerged victorious. The list of decorations attached to his uniform continued growing. Bronze stars, silver stars, Purple Hearts, Distinguished Service Crosses. The awards reflected a simple reality. Audie Murphy was repeatedly doing things that most soldiers would never attempt. His commanders recognized it. His fellow soldiers recognized it. And eventually, the enemy began recognizing it as well. German intelligence officers constantly gathered information about Allied units. They tracked commanders. They analyzed troop movements. They collected battlefield reports, anything that might provide an advantage. As Murphy's reputation grew, reports about his actions began appearing more frequently. Certain American attacks seemed unusually aggressive. Certain defensive positions held longer than expected. Certain operations succeeded despite overwhelming odds. Again and again, Murphy's name appeared in after-action reports. At first, he was simply another dangerous American soldier. But after Holtzwihr, that changed. The battle had become impossible to ignore. German units involved in the fighting reported encountering resistance far what they expected. A counterattack that should have succeeded had been stopped. Momentum had been lost. American forces had held their ground. And at the center of the story was one man. The Germans respected effective soldiers. They understood courage. They understood skill. And they understood danger. The more they learned about Murphy, the more obvious it became that he was not an ordinary opponent. Now, It is important to separate historical fact from legend. There is no surviving German document that explicitly states, "Capture Audie Murphy alive." History is rarely that neat, but numerous accounts from fellow soldiers and later historians suggest that Murphy's reputation had become widely known among German forces operating in his sector. Enemy troops reportedly discussed him. His actions became the subject of battlefield rumors. And whenever a soldier becomes famous among both friends and enemies, his value changes dramatically. Capturing such a man could provide intelligence, propaganda opportunities, morale advantages. Eliminating him could remove a highly effective battlefield leader. Either way, Murphy had become important, very important, and that made him a target. The irony is that Murphy never behaved like a celebrity. He never sought attention. In fact, many people who knew him described him as quiet, reserved, even shy. He rarely spoke about his accomplishments. He rarely bragged. While others discussed his exploits, Murphy often focused on something else entirely. The men who hadn't survived, the friends he had lost, the cost of every victory, because behind every medal was a memory, behind every success was a funeral, and behind every heroic story was a battlefield covered in casualties. As the war approached its final months, Murphy carried those memories with him. Yet despite everything he had experienced, he continued fighting, continued leading, continued volunteering for dangerous assignments. Many soldiers would have become cautious after earning so many decorations. Not Murphy. If anything, he became even more aggressive. And that aggression continued creating problems for German forces. Problems that commanders could not ignore. Because by the spring of 1945, Audie Murphy had evolved into something every fears. A soldier capable of influencing the outcome of battles. A soldier whose presence could inspire those around him. A soldier whose reputation alone affected morale. And when a single man begins having that kind of impact on a battlefield, he stops being just another soldier. He becomes a strategic problem, one the enemy desperately wants solved. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Allied armies were advancing from the west. The Soviet armies were advancing from the east. German cities were being bombed relentlessly. Factories were struggling to operate. Fuel was running out. Supplies were becoming scarce. Yet despite the increasingly desperate situation, German soldiers continued fighting. And in many places, they fought with remarkable determination. For men like Audie Murphy, this created a dangerous paradox. The closer the war came to ending, the more unpredictable the battlefield became. Some German units surrendered without resistance. Others fought to the last man. Nobody knew what to expect from one day to the next. Murphy continued leading from the front. That never changed. While some officers preferred directing operations from safer positions, Murphy consistently placed himself near the action, not because he was reckless, but because he believed leaders should share the risks faced by their men. This attitude earned enormous respect. Soldiers trusted him. When Murphy asked them to advance, they knew he would be advancing too. When he ordered them to hold a position, they knew he would remain there beside them. That kind of leadership cannot be faked. It must be earned. And Murphy had earned it many times over. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany, Murphy participated in operation after operation. The fighting remained intense. German defenders used forests, towns, rivers, and hills to slow the Allied. Every obstacle became another battlefield. Every village became another potential trap. Yet Murphy seemed to thrive in these conditions. His combat instincts had become razor sharp. Years of fighting had taught him how to read a battlefield. He could often anticipate danger before others noticed it. He recognized weak points, spotted ambushes, and reacted faster than many opponents expected. Again and again, his actions helped save lives. One officer later described Murphy as having an extraordinary ability to remain effective under pressure. While chaos overwhelmed many soldiers, Murphy somehow became more focused. The worse the situation became, the calmer he appeared. That reputation continued growing, and with every success, his status within the army increased. By now, he had become one of the most decorated soldiers in the European His list of awards was becoming almost unbelievable. Yet the decorations tell only part of the story. What truly separated Murphy from many others was consistency. Anyone can have one heroic day. Anyone can get lucky once. Murphy performed at an extraordinary level over and over again, month after month, battle after battle, campaign after campaign. The odds of maintaining that level of performance were incredibly small, and yet he did it. As a result, his name spread far beyond his own company, far beyond his own regiment. By 1945, many American soldiers had heard of Audie Murphy, even if they had never met him. His reputation had become part of Army folklore. Stories circulated around campfires. Stories spread through mess halls. Stories passed from unit to unit. Some were exaggerated, some were completely accurate. But together, they created something powerful, a legend. And legends affect morale. American soldiers drew inspiration from them. German soldiers grew wary of them. Military commanders paid attention to them. Because legends influence behavior. They influence confidence. They influence decision-making. And on a battlefield, confidence can be a weapon. The Germans understood this as well as anyone. Throughout history, armies have always paid special attention to enemy leaders, inspire troops. Capturing them can weaken morale. Eliminating them can change the course of operations. Even rumors about them can shape battlefield decisions. Murphy had reached that level. Whether German commanders viewed him as a specific target or simply as a dangerous opponent, the result was the same. His presence mattered. His actions mattered. His survival mattered. And every time he walked away from another battle, his legend grew larger. But the war was not over yet. The most dangerous thing about legends is that they often create expectations. People begin believing that certain men cannot be killed, cannot be defeated, cannot fail. History shows that those assumptions are almost always wrong. And before the war ended, Audie Murphy would discover that even legends carry. Because while the world would eventually celebrate his victories, very few people understood the price he was paying for them. When people hear stories about war heroes, they often focus on the victories, the medals, the battles, the moments of courage, the dramatic stories that make headlines. But there is another side to war, a side that rarely appears in photographs, a side that many veterans carry with them long after the fighting ends. And for Audie Murphy, that side would become impossible to escape. By 1945, Murphy had spent years living under constant pressure, years of combat, years of watching friends die, years of making life and death decisions, years of carrying responsibilities that no young man should ever have to carry. Most soldiers experienced fear. Murphy was no different. The difference was that he continued functioning despite it, again and again, day after day, battle after battle. But surviving war and escaping war are two very different things. The battlefield eventually disappeared. The memories did not. Throughout his military service, Murphy witnessed scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Men he had trained beside, men he had laughed with, men he had shared meals with, gone in an instant. A mortar round, a machine gun burst, an artillery shell. War rarely gave anyone time to say goodbye, and every loss added weight to a burden Murphy was already carrying. The public would eventually see a decorated hero. What they would not see was the exhaustion, the nightmares, the guilt, the questions. Why did he survive when so many others did not? It is a question that countless combat veterans have asked throughout history, and Murphy asked it too. As the war drew closer to its end, the physical dangers remained enormous. But a different danger was beginning to emerge, the psychological cost. At the time, few people talked openly about combat stress. Today, we use terms like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But during the 1940s, understanding was limited. Many veterans suffered in silence. Many were expected to simply move on, to forget, to continue living as though nothing had happened. Murphy would later prove that forgetting was impossible. Even while continuing to fight, signs of strain began appearing. The constant tension, the lack of sleep, the endless exposure to violence. No human being could endure those conditions indefinitely without. Yet Murphy kept going, because the war was not finished. And because the men around him still depended on him, that sense of responsibility became one of the defining characteristics of his military career. Again and again, he placed the safety of others ahead of his own. Again and again, he exposed himself to danger to protect fellow soldiers. Those actions earned admiration. They also came with a cost. Every heroic decision increased the burden he carried. Every battle added another memory. Every casualty added another scar. Not all scars are visible. The strange thing about heroes is that people often imagine them as fearless, invulnerable, almost superhuman. Murphy hated that idea. Years later, he openly admitted something many people were surprised to hear. He was afraid, often, sometimes terrified. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is acting despite fear. And few people demonstrated that better than Audie Murphy. As the war entered its final weeks, Murphy continued leading his men through some of the most dangerous territory in Europe. The German army was weakening, but it remained dangerous. Every battle still carried the possibility of death. Every mission could be the last. And yet Murphy continued doing what he had always done, leading from the front, taking risks, protecting his men, building a reputation that continued growing with every passing day. A reputation that had already made him famous among American troops. A reputation that German forces increasingly respected. And a reputation that would soon make him one of the most celebrated soldiers in American history. But before the medals, before the fame, before Hollywood, one final chapter of the war still remained. And in that chapter, Audie Murphy would cement his place among the greatest combat soldiers America had ever produced. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany was dying. The once mighty military machine that had conquered much of Europe now fought a desperate battle for survival. Cities lay in ruins. Supply lines were collapsing. Fuel shortages crippled entire units. And Allied forces were advancing from every direction. Yet despite the inevitable outcome, the fighting remained fierce. For soldiers on the front lines, the war was not over until the shooting stopped. And for Audie Murphy, there was still work to do. The young Texan had already survived more combat than most soldiers could imagine. He had faced machine guns, artillery barrages, snipers, tank assaults, ambushes, and countless situations where death seemed almost certain. Yet somehow, he was still standing, still leading, still fighting, as American forces crossed deeper into German territory. Murphy's reputation reached extraordinary levels. By now, commanders throughout the Army knew his name. Many officers requested him for difficult assignments. Soldiers admired him. Journalists began hearing stories about him. And military leadership recognized that they were witnessing something special. The list of awards attached to Murphy's uniform continued growing. Each medal represented another moment of courage. Another battle survived. Another impossible situation overcome. But the awards were not handed out simply because he fought bravely. Millions of men fought bravely during World War II. Murphy's decorations reflected something far rarer. Repeated acts of extraordinary heroism. Again and again and again. As reports from various campaigns were reviewed, a remarkable picture emerged. Murphy had consistently distinguished himself in combat at a level few soldiers ever achieved. His actions saved lives, protected units, and influenced battles. Military historians would later point out that Murphy's effectiveness came from a unique combination of traits: aggression, intelligence, leadership, and an almost unbelievable willingness to place himself in danger for others. The result was a combat record unlike almost any other American soldier of the era. Then came the recognition that would define his military legacy. The Medal of Honor, America's highest award for valor. The citation described the events near Holtzwihr, France, the burning tank destroyer, the lone defense, the relentless German assault, the refusal to retreat, the courage under fire. It was the kind of story that sounded fictional, yet it had happened, and witnesses confirmed every detail. When Murphy received the Medal of Honor, he joined a small group of Americans whose actions represented the very highest standards of military service. But the Medal of Honor was only part of the story. By the time the war ended, Murphy had accumulated an astonishing number of decorations. including multiple Silver Stars, the Distinguished Service Cross, Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, French Awards, Belgian Awards, and numerous other honors. The total was extraordinary. Historians eventually reached a remarkable conclusion. Audie Murphy had become the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II. Think about that for a moment. More than 16 million Americans served during the war. Millions wore the uniform. Hundreds of thousands fought in combat. Yet, among all of them, Audie Murphy's record stood at the very top. The skinny teenager, once rejected by recruiters, had become a military legend. The transformation seemed almost unbelievable. And the news spread quickly. Newspapers published stories about him. Photographers sought interviews. Military leaders praised his service. For many Americans, Murphy became the face of the citizen soldier. An ordinary young man who answered his country's call and performed extraordinary deeds. But while the public celebrated, Murphy himself remained focused on something. The men who never came home. The friends buried in foreign soil. The soldiers whose names would never appear in newspapers. Because Murphy understood something that many civilians did not. Every medal came at a cost. Every victory came with sacrifice. And every heroic story existed because countless others had paid a price. Still, there was no denying reality. Audie Murphy had become one of the most respected soldiers of the entire war. A symbol of courage, a symbol of determination, and a man whose name would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. Yet surprisingly, his most difficult battles were not behind him. In many ways, they were only beginning, because surviving war and learning how to live afterward are two very different challenges, and the next chapter of Murphy's life would prove just how true that was. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, millions of soldiers began the long journey home. For many Americans, victory brought celebration. Cities erupted with joy. Families filled the streets. Church bells rang. Flags waved from buildings across the nation. After years of sacrifice, the war was finally over. And among the returning heroes, few names attracted more attention than Audie Murphy. By this point, his reputation had spread throughout the United States. Newspapers published stories about his battlefield exploits. Military officials praised his courage. Journalists wanted interviews. Photographers wanted pictures. Americans wanted to meet the young soldier who had become the most decorated combat veteran of the war. The contrast was almost unbelievable. Just a few years earlier, Murphy had been an unknown teenager from rural Texas. Now, he was one of the most famous soldiers in America. Wherever he went, people recognized him. Crowds gathered. Reporters asked questions. Veterans admired him. Politicians praised him. The country saw a hero, a symbol of courage, a symbol of victory, a symbol of everything Americans had fought for during the World War II. But there was something the public couldn't see, something hidden behind the medals, behind the photographs, behind the headlines. The war had followed Murphy home, not physically, mentally, emotionally. The battlefield was gone. The memories remained. At first, Murphy tried to live a normal life. Like many veterans, he wanted to move forward, to build a future, to leave the war behind. But leaving the war behind proved far more difficult than anyone expected. At night, sleep became a struggle. Nightmares arrived without warning. Memories returned unexpectedly. Sounds triggered reactions. Certain thoughts refused to disappear. Today, we recognize these symptoms as post-traumatic stress. But in the late 1940s, very few people understood what combat trauma truly meant. Many veterans suffered in silence. Many were expected to simply move on, to be grateful they survived, to continue living normally. Murphy tried, but the weight of everything he had experienced never fully disappeared. Friends later described periods where he struggled with insomnia. Some nights he barely slept at all. The memories remained vivid. The faces of fallen friends remained vivid. The battles remained vivid. The public saw a hero. Murphy often saw ghosts. Yet despite these struggles, he continued moving forward. In 1949, his autobiography, To Hell and Back, was published. The book offered Americans a rare glimpse into the reality of combat. Unlike many wartime stories, Murphy did not glorify battle. He described fear, loss, confusion, and the terrible price paid by ordinary soldiers, readers were fascinated. The book became a major success. Many veterans recognized their own experiences within its pages. For the first time, millions of Americans began seeing war through the eyes of someone who had actually lived it. Then Hollywood came calling. Film studios recognized the power of Murphy's story. His life seemed perfectly suited for the movies. The poor Texas boy, the unlikely soldier, the battlefield hero, the war legend. Soon, Murphy found himself entering a completely different world, the world of entertainment. The transition was unusual. Most war heroes became public speakers. Some entered politics. Others returned to private life. Murphy became a movie star, and not just any movie star. He eventually played himself in the film adaptation of To Hell and Back. Imagine that. A man acting out the battles he had actually survived. A man recreating moments that had nearly killed him. A man reliving his own war for audiences around the world. The movie became a massive success. For years, it remained one of the highest-grossing films in Universal history. Americans couldn't get enough of Audie Murphy, the hero, the veteran, the symbol of courage. But even success could not erase the scars left by war. Behind the fame, behind the movies, behind the public appearances, Murphy continued fighting a different battle. A battle that many veterans understood all too well. And in the years ahead, he would make a decision that would help change how viewed the invisible wounds of war forever. As the years passed, Audie Murphy became more than a war hero. He became a symbol of courage, a symbol of sacrifice, and a symbol of the millions of ordinary Americans who answered their country's call during World War II. His story seemed almost impossible. A teenager from Texas, rejected at first because of his size, a young man many believed was too small for military service. Yet somehow, he became the most decorated American combat soldier of the war. It sounded like fiction, but it was real. Every battle, every medal, every scar. The remarkable thing about Murphy's legacy isn't simply the number of decoration he earned. It's what he did after the war. At a time when very few people discussed combat trauma, Murphy spoke openly about his struggles. He talked about nightmares. He talked about anxiety. He talked about the psychological wounds carried by veterans. Today, that may not seem unusual, but during the 1950s and 1960s, it was incredibly rare. Many veterans suffered in silence. Many felt ashamed to discuss their experiences. Many believed they were expected to simply move on. Murphy challenged that idea because he understood something important. Not all wounds are visible. A bullet wound can heal. A scar can fade. But some injuries remain hidden. And those injuries deserve recognition too. Throughout his later life, Murphy became an advocate for veterans dealing with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Long before PTSD became a widely understood term, Murphy was encouraging to take the issue seriously. In many ways, he was once again leading from the front, just as he had done during the war. Not with a rifle, not on a battlefield, but by speaking honestly about struggles many veterans were afraid to discuss. That honesty helped countless people. It helped families better understand their loved ones. It helped veterans realize they were not alone. And it helped start conversations that continue to this day. When Audie Murphy died in 1971, America lost one of its most extraordinary. He was only 45 years old. The nation mourned, veterans mourned, and countless Americans reflected on the incredible life he had lived. Today, his grave at Arlington National Cemetery remains one of the most visited resting places in the entire cemetery. Visitors come from across the country. Some come because of his military service. Some come because of his movies. Some come because of the example he set. But all come for the same reason: respect. Because Audie Murphy represented something larger than himself. He represented courage under impossible circumstances. He represented leadership when others were afraid. He represented determination when surrender would have been easier. And perhaps most importantly, he represented the ordinary American citizen to extraordinary challenges when his country needed him most. So why did the Nazis want this one soldier alive? Because soldiers like Audie Murphy are rare. They inspire the men around them. They influence battles. They change outcomes, and they become symbols. The Germans understood that. The Americans understood that. And history remembers it more than 80 years later. The legend of Audie Murphy still endures, not because he was invincible, not because he was fearless, but because he continued moving forward despite fear, despite danger, despite overwhelming odds. And that is what true courage looks like. Thank you for watching War Stories Daily. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. Do you think Audie Murphy was the greatest American soldier of World War II? Or is there another war hero whose story deserves more recognition? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy real war stories, forgotten heroes, battlefield legends, and incredible people who shaped history, make sure to subscribe and join us for future episodes. Because here at War Stories Daily, we remember the stories that history should never forget. Until next time, thank you for watching.